Hello world! Welcome back to the CyberSec 101 series. In this video, we will be discussing what the AAA is in cybersecurity. AAA is a security framework that determines access to system resources, enforces policies, and audits usage. It stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting, which help screen, manage, and log users when they access a network or system. Authentication is the first phase when invoking the AAA framework. Authentication is defined as the process of verifying a claim that a system entity or system resource has certain attribute values. In other words, authentication is the process of verifying an identity. The authentication process involves two steps: identification and verification. Identification involves presenting a unique identifier to the security parameter of a system that distinguishes the user from other users. Verification involves presenting information that corroborates the link between the user and their identifier. There are three factors for authentication: something you know, something you have, and something you are or do. Something you know would be anything that you can recall from memory, such as a PIN or password. Something you have would be anything you can physically carry, like a smart card or even a basic key. Something you are or do would be any biometric attribute or action that can be used to ID you, which could include things like fingerprint scanning or signature analysis. An even more secure method of authentication is multi-factor authentication, which is a modern type of authentication that is commonly used to gain access to secure facilities. Multi-factor authentication involves authenticating using two or more different authentication factors. For example, if I were to use a smart card coupled with a PIN code to gain access to my office, that would be a form of multi-factor authentication. With multi-factor authentication, the something you are or do factor can be considered two different factors. So if I were to use my fingerprint and my signature as the two authenticators, that would still be considered multi-factor authentication. However, if I were to use a password and a PIN to authenticate, those belong to the same factor, so that would not represent a case of multi-factor authentication. Authorization is the phase that follows directly after authentication. Authorization is defined as the process for granting approval to a system entity to access a system resource. In other words, authorization is the process of controlling access to a system and its resources. Authorization is determined by access controls, which protect systems and their resources from unauthorized access. The types of access controls that are enforced are guided by the policy they fall under, and the policy that is used is determined situationally or environmentally, depending on what types of systems and/or data require access. There are four types of access control policies that can be enforced: mandatory, discretionary, role-based, and attribute-based. Mandatory access control, or MAC, controls access by comparing security labels with security clearances. For example, there can be secret and unclassified labels which can adhere to confidential, secret, and top secret security clearances. Discretionary access control, or DAC, controls access based on the identity of the system entities and the access rules associated with the entities, and incorporates a concept of ownership in which access rights to a system resource may be granted and revoked by the entity that owns the resource. In other words, DAC controls access depending on the permissions of a system resource that are put in place by the owner of that resource, who determines who, with what identity, has access to that system resource. If you've ever seen how Linux does its file permissions, that is a perfect example of DAC being utilized. Role-based access control, or RBAC, controls access depending on the roles that users or groups of users are assigned within a system, with rules stating what access rights each of those roles have. Think of chess pieces. Each piece has a specific moveset that it is limited to depending on its role on the board, and cannot move outside of that designated moveset. Attribute-based access control, or ABAC, controls access based on properties of the user, the resource to be accessed, and the environmental conditions surrounding the system. To better visualize its meaning, you can think of ABAC as rule-based access control. Firewalls enforce rules based on what it does and doesn't want the system to send and receive from the internet or any other network entity. Accounting follows directly after authorization. Accounting is defined as keeping track of user activity after the user has been authorized. This also includes logging the user's access into the facility or system that they gained authorization to. Accounting is used to analyze user activity, behaviors, and trends via network traffic they produce, services or resources they use, or any actions they perform on the system that they gained access to that would directly affect the system or produce some sort of effect or outcome within or on the system and its resources. Some examples of common items that are logged include IP addresses, usernames, browsing history, and executed processes and programs. And that wraps it up for this video. We hope you will continue to indulge in the content discussed in this series. If you enjoyed the video, secure that like button and hack the subscribe button to attack the YouTube algorithm so that we can bring more content to your feed. Please feel free to give us any feedback, good or bad, we don't discriminate, in the comments section down below. And we hope to see you all again in the next video. Take care.